Hey there, my name is Rachael Kalaki, and welcome to the Magdala Podcast. We at Magdala know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem. The need for women to be accompanied in the journey towards healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here. Magdala exists as a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom alongside each other from sexual addiction. Our goal is to supply you with support, community, and accountability. Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to dialogue about how to heal and live fully as a Catholic woman. Wherever you are in your journey, know that you're not alone, and we welcome you to this table. I am so excited to talk about this topic. I feel like this has been on the docket for almost 3 years, and we have yet to actually cover it. How do you feel right now?
Rachael,
do you feel amped?
is this the thing that keeps you up at night? Does fantasizing about fantasizing keep you up at night?
You're about to ask. That's going to be a bad question. Fantasizing about recording a podcast episode on sexually fantasizing.
You have fantasized about this episode
I
for
have.
so long.
I have.
Now we're
I've
here.
been waiting in joyful anticipation because I think this is huge. Anyway, yes, welcome to the Magdala Podcast, Season 4, episode goodness knows what. I'm here with Annie. You guys all know Annie by this point. She's our administrative coordinator, aka spreadsheets and emails and joyful greetings to the Magdala community extraordinaire. She's also a full-time missionary at Damascus in Ohio. So that's been a super cool thing to watch you balance all of that. We just recorded a podcast episode on balance, so that's why I said it that way.
That was a good use.
Anyway, let our listeners know how your mission year's going this year.
Bro, Ohio is nice this time of year. The fall weather, so nice. We're just beginning retreat season, so when we're recording this, we just finished our first 2 retreats, and we're about to have another. How many do we have a semester? I mean, we'll basically have 2 retreats every week until mid-December at this point. So we're beginning the grind, and it's been awesome. This past weekend, we just had about 250 8th graders here for a confirmation retreat, and it was just, really holy. And it's, speaking of balance, I feel balanced at this point in my life. This is my 2nd year here. I feel balanced in my relationships, and gosh, just super grateful for what the Lord has promised and how he's fulfilling some of those promises in ways I get to speak and lead and be with my community and all sorts of stuff. So feeling great and ready to ready to talk about
fantasizing, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Perfect.
So again, this conversation's been a long time coming because out of all of the habits that I think Magdala addresses, all of the sexually addictive behaviors, I feel like this is the one that we have covered the least. And that is heartbreaking to me because I think it's huge. So sexual fantasy, we're going to break down today perhaps the difference between sexual fantasy and invasive thoughts, sexual fantasy and sexual dreams. We're going to talk about kind of sexual fantasy, how it may have played out in our own recovery stories, kind of examine why we sexually fantasize in the first place, and then also what to do about it, because the lovely women in our community and in our groups are just constantly, I think, even when they're entering sobriety in other areas, and I know this is true for me, pornography was no longer part of my life, but still, 2 or 3 years later, I'm struggling with sexual fantasy, right? It just hangs on for a long time. So just kind of initial thoughts right out of the gate, Annie, about sexual fantasy, its role in recovery, and just kind of for women suffering out there with it.
Actually, I had sort of a reflection on this earlier this week. So I told you retreats just started, and for our 6th grade faith and science retreats, we teach the kids science lessons, and I am teaching kids about fire building, something I didn't know about 2 weeks prior, but now
I can build a fire. It's going to be fine.
Now I can teach you. Well, now I can teach to 12-year-olds how to build a fire. But I share this because I spent 2 full days, doing like 9 activity rounds, building fires, and consistently looking at fire. And something initially strange happened, that at the end of the day, we have daily mass with the kids. So it's like 6 p.m. It's the end of the day. I'm going to mass with these kids. And every time I would like blink or close my eyes, all I could see in my head, in my imagination, right? All I could see was fire. And I was like, this is wild. Like every single time I close my eyes, this is all I can see. It's all I can see. At this point, it smelled like fire too. So I just like, it was a holy mass. Okay. Like I was in a prayer space. But what I was reflecting on, I was like, wow, like why does my head do that? And then I'm like, oh, well, that's the same thing of like, if I stare at the sun too long, when I close my eyes, like still all I see is like the brightness of the sun. And I can't tell you all the science behind it. The only science I know is fire building and nutrition. But what I can say is like there is something to the more we consume something and the more that we see something, our body responds by showing us that more.
Right.
And so all day I was surrounded by fire. And so at the end of the day, all I could see was fire. All I could smell was fire. Why? Because that's all I've been consuming all day. And so if you add on months, years of addiction, of sexual sin, of things that we're talking about like today, it makes sense that these things that we've consumed in excess in our psyche and in our brain, that there are images that are still existing there. So I started beginning some reflections of this earlier in the week, Rachel, when I was having this fire flash, like, gosh, I've only been doing this for a day and this is all I can see. So think of how much is still lodged up in my head, still unhealed of content that I watched for years and years.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it's just simply reactive, right? Like it's just your brain being like, hey, there's dopamine release with this particular thing. Let's try that again. Because dopamine feels really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And oftentimes the content of our fantasies is things that we have consumed, or kind of themes maybe that we tend to consume in. I'll talk more about that later. What was interesting to me in researching for my book was just how deeply fantasy and imagination are ingrained in kind of the female psyche. So there's like, I mean, in neuroscience, like there isn't like a male brain and a female brain necessarily, right? Like there's just the human brain. But because we are created uniquely by a wonderful creator who created complementary sexes, sometimes the way we function with those human brains is different, right? So oftentimes, and this is a key thing for understanding how women experience sexual addiction that just absolutely blew my mind. Men, when they're consuming pornography, right? We've talked about this before, probably. When they're consuming pornography, they attribute their arousal to the attractiveness of somebody in the video, man or woman. And they're just kind of their attraction to that person, right? And then women, when they're consuming the same visual content, this was done in a psychological test, right? When consuming the exact same visual content, women attributed their arousal in response to the videos to how well they could imagine themselves as somebody in the video, man or woman, didn't matter, right? So women have this insane intermediary of their imagination already at play in their sexuality. There's other psychologists, neuroscientists, even like quote unquote sexologists who just study sex, right? Who have kind of confirmed this, that women have, even in our interpersonal sexual experiences, this sort of like mental framing that we kind of can abstract ourselves almost from a sexual experience and almost like start fantasizing about it as it's happening and elaborating it to fit this picture that we want it to fit. So men don't do that. Men, even in interpersonal moments, like they may replace who they're like sexually interacting with. They may replace them with an image, right? But they don't take somebody in real life and obscure it to sort of this like, or expand it to kind of fit this definition of what's pleasurable to them in the same way that women do. So I think I say this, I mean, number one, to give kind of some backup and some information, but also just so that women can have a little more mercy on themselves. I think a lot of our conversations about sexuality, a lot of our conversation about sexual sin hence why Magdala exists, have been male centric for a long time, like whether secular or church conversations. We talk about sex just kind of solely from the male perspective. I was never really educated on the role that my imagination, even physiologically or neurologically, plays in my sexuality. Like I didn't know that as a woman growing up. That was something I learned in adulthood, obviously, like researching for Magdala and for my book. So I just think that's huge, that already we have imagination as a part, we're kind of playing a role in our sexuality. And so it makes sense that fantasy would be a much, much harder habit for women to kick than men, perhaps most of the time.
And it makes me think of, I don't everyone come at me when I start to make generalizations about differences between men and women. Like you got science to back you up. This is just general observation, right? But I think of me when I was little. I think of me and all my like female friends, like how much easier it was for us to be playing the games that were like, like house, right? Like imagine yourself as something that you're not. That there's something about the female imagination when you were little, like having tea parties. Like think of stuff that pretending you're a princess. Everyone pretend that you're like play pretend was at least in my experience and all the people that I knew when I was younger, like was a female dominated game when a lot of the boys were playing more. I'll say single level sort of play things as all
pretty
the
tactile
girls were always playing with things in their imagination. I think like the Lord has made man and woman with imagination for many things. Why? Because that's one of the ways he can speak to us. He can speak to us in our imaginations, in our dreams, and because it's such an important facet of how the Lord has created us. Of course, there would be somewhere the enemy wants to attack because the enemy doesn't want God to communicate with us. So he doesn't want like for you to sit in silent prayer in a chapel and close your eyes and be able to see the face of the Lord. No, that's why like the enemy's going to continue placing images and stuff and really fight you in this space because it's actually like such a sacred space. And like when we speak about like speaking to God, like it can be annoying to be like, why can't God just like speak to me like a normal human or show me something in the natural? Like people will experience signs, right? Like a bird will come to them and it's their mom's favorite bird. And the Lord does all of that. But like, just to give some more basis that like the Lord wants such deep intimacy with us that he's created, if you've heard the language of like a secret place, that he wants his prayer with us to be in this secret place in a way that I can communicate with Jesus that nobody else can, right? And so it's in that quiet voice in my head. It's in my imagination. Nobody else has access to that place but God. And so there's deep intimacy in our imagination. And because it's so sacred, because it's so intimate, because it's so good, gosh, like that's why it is so attacked. And that's why, I mean, it's one of the hardest places to get out of, even when other symptoms have sort of been resolved in this area of recovery. And so like, just know, like if this is an area in your heart right now that's hard, just know like the Lord is fighting hard to defend your imagination there, because that's a really sacred space that he wants to commune with you in. And those other things are not meant to be there, in the name of Jesus.
Amen. Yeah. I mean, Ignatian spirituality in particular is like dependent upon the imagination, right? It's so beautiful. Like spiritual exercises, it's dependent upon the faculty of the imagination. And there is something deeply personal, deeply intimate about Ignatian spirituality because of that, right? Because there's this beautiful kind of individual imagination of the Lord that he can bless and interact with you in. I think I'd love to hear more about just kind of the role that fantasy may have played in your own recovery journey. Was it part of the active struggle with pornography? Did it come after? Did it come before? Was it during? What kind of role did it play? I definitely have my own story with it as well, but I just kind of love to give like maybe some framework around for our women who are struggling of like how real this is.
Yeah, for sure. I think in my lens, when I look back at my story, it's even hard to pinpoint like where fantasizing came to be, because after a certain point, you're just not living in reality anymore. So everything's a little bit of fantasy. that it became that I can't remember the origin, but I just remember different seasons where my thought process was every time I looked at somebody, like my view was like how they could be used. I don't know how it got to that point. I would say while I was actively addicted to porn, I wasn't necessarily fantasizing outside of that. I mean, I guess everything was a little bit of fantasy. Like everything
Yeah.
was sexualized, but I like that wasn't a separate occasion, I guess you could say. And it probably wasn't until, yeah, a year or two down the line after, yeah, after really cutting out some of those other symptoms that and by this point I was diving much deeper into my prayer life, and I would do a lot of Ignatian imaginative prayer, and I would have tiny moments in prayer of like the Lord coming to me and doing something sort of sexual, and I would have to pause and I'd be like, that's not the Lord, where's that coming from?
Yeah.
And a lot of inner healing work coming back every time those things came up. But I would say that's when I most became aware of how prominent that was in my life. Because I think up until that point, I didn't really see that it was still there, or like if I
Yeah.
started to have any sort of thoughts, it would just be like, nope, in the name of Jesus, leave, and I would like find something else to do, and then I could just sort of like get past it. And so I think it was this like a few years down the line, then I really had to like deal with it. I think some other times that it's come up more dramatically or more excessively, whatever word you want to use, is in seasons where I'll just say something with my body has been triggered. So an example of this is in the community I'm in, we play this big like sports game with all the
Mm-hmm.
missionaries to kick off the year, and the game is a mix between like kickball and football and some team sport. It's one of those games, and there's rules and it all makes sense, but part of it can involve like tackling or whatever. And I remember like playing this game, and and this was all done in love, of course, but one of the male missionaries was sort of like holding on to me tightly to where I couldn't move to prevent me from getting to the ball, whatever. It
Yeah.
was all in the rules, but I remember after I felt so unsettled, and I couldn't figure out why. And
Mm,
for weeks after, the amount of images that started coming up of like different pornographic scenes that I hadn't seen in years, but I was reminded of, and I was like, why are these all coming up again? And it's because
yeah.
I was triggered into this memory of like what it would feel like to be, I would say, held and not able to be let go. I think so.
Mm,
That's one moment that I feel comfortable sharing, but I can just pinpoint like multiple moments near the end of my recovery, specifically from pornography, and then outside of that, once I remained sober, of pretty much any time I experienced, I'll say, an attack on the body where I felt unsafe, my brain would
mm,
automatically go to these places, because that's what it thinks of when my body's in that state. That's what it thinks of, all these other images of times I imagine me being in that place. So
mm,
yeah, I think those are some of the ways that fantasy has found its way into my life.
yeah.
Your turn.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that's like a really good concrete example that I think a lot of us can relate to. Yeah, I don't know when fantasy really began, because it's like I think it was prior to my exposure to pornography. Because I had violating experiences in my childhood, I had more of a framework to work with. And so, yeah, fantasy kind of predated my exposure to pornography and then kind of accompanied it. And then it lasted until about, I want to say 3 years into sobriety. I was still deeply struggling. And it slowly became something less like expansive, where it was just about anyone, or you could use the content that you had consumed, and again those themes or whatever became something less expansive to something more centralized, that would play out in my relationships. It was like a temptation that I would have to like really kind of squash or whatever. And, yeah, it became, it became increasingly difficult the more attracted to someone I was. And eventually I kind of started to let go of like, yes, I mean, letting go and rejecting the temptation to fantasize, but also letting go of like, okay, if I'm really, really attracted to a man I'm dating, that means I am like physically attracted to him. So it's okay if my brain kind of pokes these thoughts into my head of just sexual attraction. It's like, okay, that's great. How can I just sit with that, bless it, leave it to the Lord, not think about it, not fantasize? So it was kind of an interesting journey of letting it kind of just slowly evolve into something different. And I think that's key too, is that we're not trying to shut down our imagination, which a lot of us do. We're not trying to shut down the part of us that's sexually attracted to people, right? We're trying to redirect it to like, where is this headed? What is this leading us towards? Because I know for me, it became something that I would turn to in stress, or like just moments of discomfort or boredom, right? Like I could be bored in class or something and could all of a sudden be fantasizing, whether sexually or not. Like I could just turn to some sort of fantasy. And it's just an escape. It's an escape from reality oftentimes, and an escape from discomfort or pain or suffering or awkwardness, or I mean, even just quite simply boredom. So for me, it became, just sort of I want to say like a secondhand smoke from my porn addiction almost for several years. And it does carry the scent of that addiction with it, right? When they've gone together in your life. So for me, I would fall into fantasy and would think like, oh my gosh, I'm back exactly where I was. Like nothing's happened. And in a sense that was true. Like fantasy was an indication of deeper healing needed in my heart and needed in my life. And I think a key point came for me in high school when I realized, oh my gosh, like, because I think maybe you believe this lie too. Somewhere in my mind, I thought that sexually fantasizing was better, quote unquote, better than consuming pornography, right? And it's like, well, no, like I'm still using people. I'm creating pornography in my own mind. That's what sexual fantasy does. So I think there's a moment of like recognizing the gravity of it, of what you're doing. But then also kind of recognizing with a lot of self-compassion, sometimes just what it becomes. Like you're just really stressed, or you can't sleep, you're anxious. I experienced a lot of anxiety in college and beyond. So I know for me, it was like a stress factor sometimes too. Or you're bored, or you're longing for connection, which is something I kind of want to dive into as well. Is like Jay Stringer talks about, I mean, he does this kind of with any sexual habit that we don't want, right? But just being curious about the reason why, and talking even about fantasy, like what themes come up in your fantasy, or what triggers you to fantasize, or all of these things. Like instead of shutting it down, be curious about it. And I'm wondering if you ever took that approach, and then what did that do for you?
Yeah, I love what you were sharing of asking the why. And it's the reality that the core of all our desires are good. The core of all our desires point to Jesus, to heaven. Yeah. And so there's goodness even in these things that will come up that you don't want to deal with, you know. And I think that's where so much healing has happened in my own life, right? Like you shared this example, right? It's like if I'm in a relationship with someone who I really love, and my mind will start to fantasize about that, I can pause and say, Jesus, thank you so much that there's someone that I want to be this close with. That's a really good thing. Like someone I'm discerning something like that with. All of that is really good. Now, Jesus, that's not the season I'm in. Can you help me? Like not to fantasize about that, you know? But so recognizing that that's a really good thing. Or, I think a lot of my fantasy would come from, just a deep longing for intimacy, whether that's physical connection, like, I'll say even like physical stimulation, and not even in a sexual way, but just like, gosh, like, could someone hug me? Or like, you just want to be like wrapped up tightly in a blanket. Like I that sounds silly, but that was something that my body, in a sense, really, really needed for comfort, and I didn't have. So then it starts going elsewhere. But the goodness in that is like, wow, I am made for intimacy. I am made to be close to people. And
Yeah.
actually my body is an extension of me, and the fact that I want someone to be close with me, all of that is so good, right? And
Yeah.
so I think what you just shared of the curiosity, when I was able to ask the questions of, what is the deeper meaning? Why am
Mm-hmm.
I here? And like, this is the part that always sounds scary and confusing, but it's like, can I actually invite the Lord into that fantasy? Hear what I'm
Yeah.
saying and not what I'm not saying. I'm not saying like, okay, as you're fantasizing, then picture Jesus like in the, no, 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 no. I mean like, can I, again, this is called inviting the Lord into our mess, but can I
Yeah.
look at this face that's sort of gross to look at, that I'm thinking of this stuff, but then be able to invite Jesus into a dialogue and say, okay, Lord, like this theme or this image or whatever it is keeps
Yeah.
coming up, like can you help reveal to me, like Holy Spirit, would you show me like what this actually means? And so
Yes.
I think a lot of my processing had to do, inviting the Lord in, asking the why.
Mm.
And specifically, so much of my healing has come from when I've allowed the Lord to speak the goodness of what I was actually seeking over that. Because once I could see myself as how he sees me, which is good, and so he sees me, he's not mad at me. He's just like, oh, Annie, like you just want to be close to someone right now. Can I be that someone? Like when I
Mm.
hear that voice from Jesus, I melt. And then I can't be mad at me, because then I look at me, the me that I'm like, oh, I'm so bad and I should be ashamed, whatever. But then I look at me and I'm like, you're so good.
Yep.
I think
Yep.
that's where I've been able to heal. So it's seeing the good in it too when asking the why. I feel like that's what's been most fruitful in
Oh
my life.
gosh. Yes. That's so good. Yeah. I think examining just kind of the themes that would come up in my fantasy, specifically throughout college, and praying about it, it was the Lord just revealed the deep desire to be chosen. And that led to just kind of a season of prayer of like, just allowing the Lord to tell me in his own way, whatever it looked like each day, that I was chosen, that he chose me,
Yeah.
And it met such a deep need in my heart that like in my fantasy, I was, yes, like relieving stress, relieving boredom, but I was also working on a feeling of rejection. I was experiencing that. I was trying to imagine, a way in which I didn't have to feel that anymore. And that's what we're doing through a lot of our sexual fantasies. We're trying to work out our pain, right? We're trying to work out our longing in a way where we don't need the Lord. We don't need him to come in. We're just going to take care of it ourselves. That's kind of the lie of fantasizing. But yeah, I think that's huge. Is not just this like, shut it down, get it out. It's like, okay, no, what's behind this? Because if I don't address what's behind this, it's just going to keep coming up in a different way each time. I was just up training some missionaries for a really wonderful apostolate, and got to have one-on-ones with these sweet young men and women. They were so good. And one woman was telling me that she was still struggling with fantasy quite a lot. And she was just like, yeah, and I just pray Hail Mary and I do this and I do that. And I'm like, okay, God bless you, first of all, for wanting to be better, right? But like, have you ever tried examining like what's going on? And her eyes just kind of went wide. And I was like, yeah, just like ask the Lord, like what's going on in your heart? Like, what are you looking for? Look for themes, look for, whatever. And we kind of dived in a little bit together in discussion, but I was like, and then pray the Hail Mary, like have curiosity, pray for grace, right? And that curiosity, for it to be holy, for it to be an anointed curiosity, and not just something that will get you deeper entrenched in your lack of reality, but rather like ask for the grace, have holy curiosity, and then pray for release of the fantasy, for release from the temptation. But like the Lord wants to teach us through our imagination, even if it's imagining things that are objectively wrong and evil and damaging.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
I don't know.
I can even think to places of one of the, I'll say, motivations that got me into pornography and masturbation was just already being in a place where I was acting in sexual sin with other people, and so I wanted to, I'll say, learn how to be better. And so a part of my motivation that got me deeper into my addiction had to do with I'll say an educational purpose, but later down the line, as I continued to struggle with either fantasy or falling back into porn, masturbation, whatever it was, like all three of them, one of the things that would often trigger it, that I wasn't able to connect these dots down the line, but was when I would enter into feelings and seasons of inadequacy.
Oh,
Um, because what that was actually triggering was this go back 5 years prior to where I felt inadequate in giving
oh,
sexual pleasure to people, and I wanted to know how to do it better. And so that was something that would come up, and it's interesting to think about, because of course, like when fantasies would start coming up, I wasn't automatically able to be like, wow, I feel inadequate right now,
right.
right? I was just like, gosh, I'm already having a bad day, and now this is going on. And so all I felt was even worse, because I felt like ashamed that I was still having these thoughts.
Mm,
But it was being able again to ask the why, to be like, gosh, like I feel inadequate not because these thoughts are coming up, but I felt inadequate prior, and that's why these thoughts are coming up. It's also interconnected, and it's like, and the Lord's not trying to hide from us. It's not a puzzle. It's not
right.
like, well, I've asked the why question, and it's leading me to trauma when I was 3, which is connected to like sometimes prayer is like that for sure, but it's like the Lord's not trying to hide the answer from you. He's just like He wants to give you the longings of your heart.
Yeah,
And so being able to answer the question, like, what is it you actually want? And when that's being unmet, like your body is going to respond in a way of trying to help you meet that what need in the way that it knows how. And I
yes.
think that was something I struggled with for a while after. I'll say when I reached a point of sobriety, at least in like porn and masturbation, was something I struggled with. Was my I'll say my body would still start to respond or get turned on to things that I wasn't intentionally working towards. You
Right.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
would get so frustrated. I'm like, I'm out of this, and I'm not doing the active things to put in this situation. Why is it working against me?
Yeah.
Well, my body actually had an unmet need. Now, the unmet need wasn't inherently sexual in nature, but
Right.
after so many years of meeting that unmet need with sexual pleasure, it
Yep.
did what it knew how to do. And so I felt like my body was working against me, but my body in the scheme of things was trying to help me. I had to
Right.
retrain it to teach it. Like how do I actually, like when I am in need of actual like connection with a person,
Yes.
because that's a real need as humans that we
Yep.
all have. How do I meet that in a healthy way? And so I had to like actually retrain
Yes.
my body, like physically, in the imagination, all of that stuff. It's all interconnected.
Yeah. You're hitting on a key point here that replacement behavior, replacement images are huge. Like I think this was a game changer for me in letting go of fantasy. It was just I was speaking with a woman who was in recovery herself when I was in college. We were at Seek, and just a beautiful conversation. But she said something about how I was talking about still struggling with sexual fantasy. And she told me to create in my mind like the most beautiful monstrance that I could, in which to place the Eucharist and throne the Lord, right? Or chapel, or just somewhere beautiful where I wanted to pray. And she's like, etch it as clearly as you can in your mind, like just a still image of where you can go to. And when you find yourself kind of in the midst of a sexual fantasy, snap your fingers and imagine yourself going there. Like literally physically snap your fingers if you need to. And it was such a simple thing, but just having a go-to replacement image was really key for me. Like just having, okay, this is, I know I actually want to go here. I actually want to be here with the Lord. I'm going to go there instead. Sometimes I literally had to snap my fingers to remind myself out loud, which, you know, if you're not by yourself in your room, that's a weird thing to do, but you got to do it. But whatever the replacement behavior is, or like the retraining that you're talking about, that is a key part. Is we're not just eliminating fantasy. We have to rebuild our imagination. We have to reorient it. There's so many scholars who talk about the importance of the Catholic imagination or the Christian imagination, that our imagination has to be baptized to see, right? To see God clearly, to see Him clearly in our everyday lives, and to take that into our imagination. So retraining can look different for multiple people, but that was something I found incredibly helpful, was just having an image that I could turn to when other images were kind of flooding my mind. The other thing that just really stuck out to me when you were talking about just feelings of inadequacy and how that would trigger, like, isn't that so true though, that sometimes the trigger is just like so far from sexual and you're like, what, how is this a thing, right? Like, it's just the way it goes. And I think when examining our triggers, we can be like a little too superficial or a little too base, where we're like, oh, my trigger is feeling lonely because I'm single. And it's like, yeah, that's absolutely a trigger, right? But go deeper than that. Go deeper. Like, go beyond the things that you wouldn't see relating to your sexuality, but your sexuality is a part of your person. It's integrated into your person. That's what chastity is the integration of your sexuality according to your state in life, right? So it makes sense that these things that you experience emotionally, professionally, physically, like all of them can kind of manifest themselves in sexual temptation because you're a sexual being. It's a part of your body. It's a part of you being a human person. So anyway, just out of that note, but yeah, what does retraining imagination look like for you? What does maybe some practicals of how people can begin to do that?
Yeah, that's sweet. I think replacement images, like you shared, is really, really helpful for I'll say the during. I think something that was really helpful for me in, I'll say prevention. So, well, think about it in a sports analogy, right? Like when I'm playing in my softball game, I'm not training for it. I'm like in the
Right.
game, And so there's enough training you have to do beforehand. So when you're not in a space of being triggered, how do I train myself to be stronger when those things come up?
Yes.
And something that was beneficial to me. Well, I'll use an example first of like if in my eating disorder recovery. I thought my body was gross and ugly and all of these things because I thought my body was only meant to be something physically attractive. So I had to retrain my thought process about my body to see it as good, specifically in being like, okay, can I look at myself in the mirror and maybe not be the happiest with how I look, but still recognize like my stomach and digestive system are popping off right now. Like I have lungs that are just going crazy. I got trillions of cells. I can't even
Right.
count to a trillion. I got trillions of cells working just to keep me like standing up straight right now. And so I can recognize my body is good in that sense, and being able to start with that as a foundation before I go into, I'll say feeling like I was physically attractive. Like that,
Yeah.
that was a thought process I had to train myself in to be able to acknowledge that my body is good before I went somewhere else. And so in fantasy, like something that I had to do in a preventative step was just that with imagination. Can I
Yeah.
acknowledge my imagination is good? Can I have experiences of my imagination being good?
Yeah.
Leading up to these points of getting triggered. And so like, I mentioned this earlier, imagination is a key place the Lord wants to commune with you and speak with you. So in
Yes.
places where you're not feeling triggered and you're not in fantasy and you're able to be in prayer in your imagination, have good experiences with your imagination and with the Lord, because that begins to train you in recognizing that this is a good and safe space for you to be in, for you to have dialogue and images and all of that. Like that's a good and holy space for you to be in,
Yes.
so that you I'll say begin to crowd out the other things. So I think what you shared is an awesome practical for during. I think this was a key part that sort of helped train me in the in between time, to strengthen me that when I got to other images, got triggered into places I didn't want to be, I could be able to take a step back and being like, okay, this is a good space that I want to be in, but what I'm seeing in this space is not good. So how do I orient from there,
Yeah. Yeah. Because otherwise it results in the shutting down of imagination and you lose all of the gift that's in there. Because without imagination, you can't be creative. You can't
Yeah.
be like, you can't express your unique individuality. Your imagination is so important. Like the Lord loves dreaming. He loves creativity. He loves expression. I think, yeah, what you're saying is key, is the preventative measures and then the things during. I know I'm focusing more on things during, but something that always kind of calls me back to reality if I'm feeling kind of suspended, which is what fantasy does. It suspends us from reality, right? Like, breath is huge. Like, there's so much in scripture about just the breath of God and the Holy Spirit. And But yeah, just kind of like a mindfulness practice of examining your breath, breathing in slowly, breathing out slowly, and just kind of feeling your breath as it fills your body. Feel it leave, kind of imagine it reaching to your fingertips and your toes and then coming back, something about that of just focusing on your breath or focusing on your heartbeat calls you back to reality. It calls you back to the present. So catching yourself in a fantasy instead of immediately beating the crap out of yourself, orient yourself with breath, with like, okay, I'm coming back to reality. Or even if it's just an intrusive thought, which we should define in a second, bring yourself back to reality, then maybe step into that curiosity about what you're looking for. But I love that, yeah, you have to start with a base of that, like, this is good. This is a safe, the imagination is a safe place to walk into when you're with the Lord. So you can walk into it. You don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to shut it down. It's actually tragic to shut it down. But yeah, kind of quick defining on, let's talk about the difference between a sexual dream, a fantasy, and an intrusive thought, because I think this is huge, right? Like, a lot of women probably think they're sexually fantasizing when they haven't given their consent, whether it's in a dream or it's a thought. So I kind of just want to define that. But yeah, I feel like sexual dreams deserve their own podcast episode, because man, they just really bother us. They bother everyone. But okay, let's start here. How would you define a fantasy, and how do you know when you're in one? Let's put that out there.
Gosh, these are all such, I would love to hear if you have more clear boundaries, I would say, in your definition, because
Sure.
even when you say that, I'm like, there's such a gray area. They all sort of overlap, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I mean, I think most clearly in my mind, like, an invasive thought would be the space where I don't necessarily give consent. Mm-hmm. It's something that can then lead to fantasy. And yeah, fantasy would be the thing that I would then engage in some way, yes, or then give consent in one way. But because they're so interconnected, sometimes even within a fantasy, there will be like a continuation of an invasive thought that I didn't give consent to, but because mm-hmm. I gave consent to the fantasy, then that thought is still there. So, mm-hmm. so there's almost like an overlap of both. So I think it's hard to disconnect one from the other. But I think the good distinction that I know you're trying to make is that, like, just because I had a thought doesn't mean I'm sinful and I'm going to hell. You know, like a sin is something that you do have to act on, and fantasizing can be sinful 100%. But yeah, to recognize that, like, we're all wounded, and so when parts of these woundedness are coming up that we for sure didn't ask for, you know what I mean? It's mm-hmm. like I was just trying to play this sports game, and I'm starting seeing images in my head of like porn I watched 5 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, I did not consent to that. You know, that's just there. But it's what I then continue to do with that. Yeah, it is on me. But I would love to hear if you have more, I'll say, clearer boundaries.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head. I think an intrusive thought is maybe triggered, but also can be seemingly random, and it's something that you don't give your consent to. It also can continue to intrude even when you reject it. That's one of the hardest things, right? Is when you're like, nope, not going to think about it. And it's like, but you are. And you're like, no, please, madam, return to your assigned seat. And it's like, but you're going to think about me. And it'll keep coming back. That can happen about anything, right? But yeah, it's seemingly random. I think it's those moments, whether they're sexual or not, right? Intrusive thoughts are just kind of where we need to realize, like, we are not our thoughts. Our thoughts are not our identity. Yes. And our brains can just do very random, very weird things where you're like, why did I just think about punching that person in the face? I don't want to punch that person in the face. Why was that about that game? What? You know, and you just kind of move on. Yeah, or I remember, this is such a weird example of an intrusive thought, but when I worked at the diocese in Nashville, I was walking with my boss once, and we had these great, like, bright orange mugs, right, that our faith formation office used. And I remember walking down this hallway. We would go to get coffee from one of the lounges in a different part of the building. We'd be walking back with our coffee, and we're just chatting, and we're walking down the long hallway back to our office. And there was a brick wall at the end of this hallway. And I mean, every single time we walked down this hallway with our coffee, I imagined myself just chucking that bright orange mug down the hallway against that brick wall and watching it shatter, right? And I finally just looked at my boss one day. I was like, do you ever imagine yourself chucking the mug at the brick wall and like watching it shatter? And she looked at me, she was like, no, should I have hired you? Like, she was just like really concerned. No, but that's an example, right? It's like, no, I have no idea where that thought came from. I just saw the brick wall and just thought it. But we're not our thoughts. We don't have to identify with them. And it's the same with sexual thoughts, because they can be so random. Especially when you do have a history of consuming pornography, because you have this whole tab of images that are in your memory. Those memories can be healed, right? But that doesn't mean they necessarily vanish. And so if it comes up, that doesn't mean you've consented to bringing it back up. I do think fantasy is consented. I think you kind of, it's when your imagination, your creativity is spurning this image on, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to keep going. So sometimes you give your consent, even if you're kind of like passive about it. I'm just like, why not for just a second? But yeah, I'd say that's fantasy. And the sexual dream is obviously like any dream where sexual anything becomes a part of it, and those can just be wacky. And I know the women in our community feel a lot of guilt over them, and I did too for a time. But I think a sexual dream is just like again, when you're consuming a lot of pornographic content, maybe they can be more frequent. But then also when you're in sobriety and in recovery and you're not consuming this content anymore, your brain can kind of be like, where'd that go? And bring it back up. Also, just to note, sexual dreams can be a combination of who you interacted with at the office that day and what you ate for dinner and whether or not you're ovulating, right? Like, it can be the most random physiological stuff. So I don't know if I have clear definitions of the three, but those are kind of, I guess, a little bit more framing around them, just so that women aren't thinking that they're fantasizing when they're dreaming or when they're just having some thoughts, you know?
For sure. And I think that's a great distinction. And I think this is a good, I'll say, safe place to land, that there aren't clearer boundaries, because I think the scrupulous among us want the very clear of, well, if I've thought about this thought for 5.5 seconds, then that means I'm engaged.
Fantasy.
You know what I mean? And it can get, all of us in our minds can be scrupulous and perfectionist and all this stuff. And I think like there's just no space for any of that. I think there just needs to be a deeper awareness of like, well, I'm broken here. And for the places that are sin, great, go to confession. For the places that you're not sure, great, go to confession. Yes, exactly. and to live in the freedom and recognize there's mercy in all of those places, and there's healing in all of those places. And if you focus on too much of like if you focus too much on the boundary and what is sin, then you're missing the mercy. You know, the whole sin was not the sin, it was the cross, and we're missing the cross if we're trying to like document the clear boundaries of what is what, you know? Right.
And also kind of another sort of caveat in there, kind of revisiting too, attraction is not fantasizing, right? Like, I think this just needs to be said. Like, if you're dating someone and you have, like, you're sitting with your boyfriend on the couch playing a board game, I don't know, doing whatever, and you have the thought that of something sexual, oh, okay, that's probably because you're feeling pretty close to your boyfriend. That's actually like a pretty well ordered thing, right? So I think we often, I know that's a place I got really scrupulous. That's a place where a ton of Catholic women get scrupulous, right? Is like, oh my gosh, am I fantasizing? It's like, no, you might just be sexually attracted to the person you're discerning marriage with. Good for you. You're going to need that later, right? Like, it's just, I think we've eroticized everything to the point where even just simple attraction is just like over eroticized, oddly enough, or ironically enough, but that's not the same as fantasy. So which I think is a conversation we're going to have another time too. It's just
for sure
chastity for the real ones though, because anyway, but any other practical thoughts on fantasy, how to let it go, how to reground in reality?
I don't know how practical this is. I think the thought that keeps going through my head is when we talk about fantasy, it becomes a little bit more nuanced than say like if I looked at pornography, then I fell, right? So I can
Right.
clearly label that. And I think
Right.
when you're recovering from anything in this area of sexual sin, it's hard to St. Paul asked us to pray unceasingly. So the more that I talk to Jesus on a regular basis, then the more I'll talk to him in all the little things. Okay.
Yes.
So when I've just consumed a lot of sexual content and I'm living in sexual sin, then that becomes a sort of floaty, unceasing thought in my head, right? Like you said, like invasive thoughts can keep coming
Yep.
back up and back up. And so I think, let me try to articulate the point I'm trying to make. That like when we talk about porn, it can be very clearly like I fell, but when we talk about fantasy in between invasive thoughts, it's just more of this floaty space. And I think this isn't a practical. This is a maybe a call on for my own heart, for all of us in a space of healing. The recognition that these things exist, and it doesn't mean if you have more, let's say, invasive thoughts this day than the day before, it doesn't mean you're now doing worse in recovery. I think it just means like that we're human and things come in waves and in different seasons, and the Lord wants to heal different parts of us when more things are coming up. And so I think like specifically in this area, I'm glad we're finally doing an episode of it, because there's a deeper need for even more grace in this area, because not only can it be sinful, but then it can also be all the overthinking and comparison that will come on top of trying to figure out if it's sinful or not. And I think there's just like a deeper needed grace here of recognizing that it's a constant need for healing, that some of these things are going to stay around for a while, and recognizing even once you're in a deep space of sobriety that like you are still affected by your wounds. Like the image, if you've ever heard this in a talk, right? Like a little kid playing baseball and like hits a baseball into his neighbor's like window and shatters the window. Like he can go up to the neighbor and ask for forgiveness, and the neighbor can forgive him. But then there's still a broken window that has to be taken care of, right?
Yep.
And so I can be fully forgiven by the Lord. All of my major symptoms, like I can be in a place of sobriety and recognizing that there's still deep brokenness that has happened from past mistakes. Not that I have to linger in. There's no shame. In the name of Jesus, there's no shame.
Yeah.
But recognizing because of that space of brokenness, I am in a space of weakness there, in a space of vulnerability. And that's okay. Yeah. and that's where there's grace. And so if there are seasons where it's coming up more than it did in the season before, like it doesn't mean you're falling behind. It doesn't mean you're going backward. Like there's something more and there's something deeper there. And if we try to, like you said earlier, if we try to stay in the superficial surface of trying to just say, oh, I'm lonely, that's why it's coming up more. It's like, no, like I think we're really missing the Lord if we stay too superficial. So just like the deeper we're allowing ourselves to ask the why, and the more grace that we're just able to receive, like I think that will be most beneficial when navigating fantasy and invasive thoughts and all of this.
Yeah. Wow. Beautifully said. I think one of the more difficult pieces of criticism I've received on a podcast I've done was a few months ago, and a woman submitted to us saying that she, really related to what I had said on this podcast or whatever, until I said that I was still healing. And then she said that caused a ton of hopelessness and discouragement in her. And that was difficult to receive. Number one, obviously this woman, is suffering, and but there's a lot of hope and a lot of beauty in her story as well. But it was difficult to receive because it's like, gosh, how do we get anywhere if we don't think that, Like I can't imagine looking at my life and thinking like, yep, I've got it, I'm good. And I think what you said just points to that of like, we want so badly just for everything to be tied up neatly with a little bow and then put in the back corner. And that's just not it. And fantasy is just one of the many symptoms of that. Even now, like I wouldn't say I struggle with fantasy anymore, but like do I struggle, with the temptation to lust even after my spouse, of just like when I'm feeling attracted to him, of like, do I struggle with the temptation not to use him for my own good or for my own pleasure? Yeah, absolutely. That's part of working things out in a sexual relationship with someone, even in a marriage, is literally sacrificing over and over and over for their good, even when you don't want to, like, or you just want to prioritize yourself. That's part of working it out, right? And I think that's also where, like, when I talk about the slow fade of sexual fantasy of my, like, in my life into just being at peace with attraction, that's kind of what happened. It's like, if you imagine like sexual fantasies up here and it just kind of slowly descended back down to earth, where it's just like, it's just attraction. It's just sexual attraction that was left. And because that's not going to go away. And I think a lot of times, like, we wait for that to go away as kind of the final sign, or the, I guess the final sign that kind of, let's tie it up with a bow. Okay, like, now I don't even experience the temptation to lust after people. And it's like, that's not going to go away. Like, we are out of Eden. Maybe it won't happen frequently. I don't know. It doesn't happen frequently for me, I'd say, but like, it's still going to happen. We're still on earth. We're still sinful people. We're still in need of healing. And yeah, I think we want it tied up neatly out of a sense of control. And, so I can't imagine like looking at my life without recognizing like how much more healing I need, whether sexually or otherwise,
I loved everything that you just said, and it made me recognize that, like, in this area of my life, like, I would never, I wouldn't say I struggle with fantasy anymore, but I wouldn't even use the language of like struggle with invasive thoughts. I mean, I guess that's what you could say, like, happens sometimes, but it like it's not a struggle. It's just like a deep awareness of what you just said. Yeah. It's a deep awareness of like, I'm someone who's healing, who lived a lot of past life. And so that's still just like a part of me. Like, I'm a new creation. Let me make two distinctions. Like, I'm a new creation in Jesus Christ. I've been washed by the blood, and I've been healed incredibly in a lot of ways, like insane, real, fruitful healing of things that have never gone back.
Right.
I have still been wounded, right? There's still the broken window, right? Like, I've received the grace. I'm a new creation. There's still the broken window. And so it's like, when those things come up, I wouldn't even say it's like a struggle. It's just like, oh, yep, that's me. That's my walk. That's, yep. It feels so natural, to know, how do I, like, I was going to say it feels so natural to have disordered thoughts, but like, all my life I've had thoughts that are disordered. That's called humanity, Yeah. And so it's natural to have thoughts that come up that aren't in alignment with what the Lord wants for me. It just makes for better dialogue with the Lord. So I think, I think something the two of us experience that, I just like pray for an impartation over anyone listening, is like, we've just been able to receive, a level of, I'll call it comfortability in our stuff and our mess.
Yes.
to know that, like,
right,
some of it's still going to be there. There's a remnant of it. You can vacuum the floor, and there's still like little things that you missed, and they're going to pile up over time, And so just like, there's actually like a lot of peace that I can have knowing, like, okay, there's still stuff under that rug. Great, we'll get there when Jesus asks me to get there. When it comes up, great, we'll deal with it then. But like, I wouldn't even say it's like a struggle. It's just humanity. It's just me existing, and that's good. That's good. That's part of the walk.
Well, there goes my phone. Sorry, Emery cut.
Jesus is calling.
Jesus is calling. No, I think that's key, because just like, it's the thorn in our side, right? Of just reminding us of our weakness. St. Paul asked to be delivered of his thorn how many times, and it didn't happen, because we need the reminders that we're so weak. So I know intrusive thoughts in a small way can be that. Ongoing rejection of fantasy, regrounding yourself in reality can be that. So, yeah. Or even dreams. Even dreams can be a thorn in your side a little bit, that you need to turn over to the Lord and just recognize it in your weakness. He's got his strengths. So kind of wrapping up, are there any final thoughts on fantasy that you have, or overcoming it?
I feel like my final thoughts are always the same, but We can never receive too much mercy. And he has so much mercy
He does.
and so much grace. And something I live by, I like want this on a t-shirt. It's like, I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself seriously. And there's a
Yeah.
difference. And so it's like, I can take my recovery seriously, but not take myself too seriously.
Right.
And again, it's in recognizing my humanity and recognizing my math. It's like, oh, it's just there. And,
Yep.
and we're gonna do something about it. And that's because I know the mercy of the Lord. And like, he's not fazed. He doesn't look at me and be like, oh, gasp, I can't believe. No, he's like, oh, Annie, come here. You know, like, let's wipe that marker off your face and try again.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like he's not mad at me. And so it's like, when I can live in the reality that he's not mad, that he has
Yeah.
mercy. It's literally, it's the feeling of like the sigh of relief. Like, everyone just take a deep breath. Like,
Yeah.
you are actually okay. And the
Yeah.
Lord has mercy and healing for you there. So I think that's just my word of encouragement. Wherever you're coming in this conversation, whether you feel encouraged or whether you're still annoyed that this is a part of your life, Jesus Christ is real. He
Yes.
loves you. He's not mad at you. He's not scandalized by what you've done years ago or what you've done today.
Yeah.
And he just wants to come close to you again every
Yeah.
single day. So there's
Amen.
mercy, and it covers all of it.
Amen. I don't think I have anything more exceptional than that to add. Yeah, I just love, I love living in reality. That's kind of just like a core focus of my life, is like living in reality. I think so much of our world is aimed at suspending us from reality or trapping us in representations of reality and not reality itself. And I think it's just one of the tragedies of fantasy is that it takes us away from reality, which is where the presence of God is, where the truth is, where he is, where beauty is, right? But coming back to it again, like it can be a slow process. And also none of us live perfectly in reality. Like, it's a daily effort to just live entirely in reality, to not allow myself to be totally abstracted, whether by temptation or distraction or busyness or whatever may come into my day to rob me of the ability to be in the Lord's presence. But he's always there. He's always there, just ready to help you reground. And that's, I think, one of the most beautiful parts is, again, it can just take a simple breath. It can take a simple prayer and you're back. Cause he's always waiting and always reaching out his hand. So yeah. Well, thank you, Annie, for joining me on the long-awaited conversation on fantasy. If you liked this episode, like our podcast, subscribe to it. Maybe share it with a friend. You got to be tactful, though, because you don't just want to, shoot a random friend an episode on fantasy and say, I feel like you're fantasizing. You should probably listen to this episode. Anyway, we trust your tact. But if you are a woman who is in need of support and accountability as you're recovering from a sexual addiction, you can find the link below to join one of our groups. If you're a woman who has had her own healing journey is interested. Wow. If you're a woman who has had her own healing journey and is interested in helping other women do the same, you can also find the link to inquire about being a small group moderator below as well. If you'd like to bring a Magdala group to your college campus or to your parish, that link is in our show notes as well. Words are so hard, guys. If you are in need of accountability software, you can use the code Magdala to get 30 days free of Covenant Eyes. And if you want to break from your smartphone, you can use the code below to get a discount off of a light phone, which is a tech minimalist phone that will hopefully free you up a little bit. And finally, if you're interested in getting more exclusive content while supporting Magdala's community, you can become a patron at the link below. Or if you're just interested in financially supporting us and also prayerfully supporting us, you can consider becoming a donor, and you'll find that link below as well. We're grateful for every woman, every man, everybody who's a part of our community, every which way. And hopefully we'll catch you soon. No, I think that's key because, yeah, just like, it's the thorn in our side, right? Of just reminding us of our weakness. St. Paul asked to be delivered of his thorn how many times, and it didn't happen because we need the reminders that we're so weak. So I know intrusive thoughts in a small way can be that. ongoing rejection of fantasy, regrounding yourself in reality can be that. So yeah. Or even dreams can be a thorn in your side a little bit that you need to turn over to the Lord and just recognize that in your weakness, he's got his strengths. Yeah. So kind of wrapping up, are there any final thoughts on fantasy that you have, or overcoming it?
I feel like my final thoughts are always the same, but you can never receive too much mercy. And he has so much mercy and so much grace. And something I live by, I want this on a t-shirt. It's like, I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself seriously. And there's a difference. And so it's like, I can take my recovery seriously, but not take myself too seriously.
Right.
And again, it's in recognizing my humanity and recognizing my mess. It's like, oh, it's just there. And we're going to do something about it. And that's because I know the mercy of the Lord. And like, he's not fazed. He doesn't look at me and be like, oh, gasp, I can't believe. No, he's like, oh, Annie, come here, like, let's wipe that marker off your face and try again. Like, he's not mad at me. And so it's like, when I can live in the reality that he's not mad, he has mercy. It's literally, it's the feeling of like the sigh of relief. Like, everyone just take a deep breath. Like, you are actually okay. And the Lord has mercy and healing for you there. So I think that's just my word of encouragement. Wherever you're coming in this conversation, whether you feel encouraged or whether you're still annoyed that this is a part of your life, Jesus Christ is real. Yes. He loves you. He's not mad at you. He's not scandalized by what you've done years ago or what you've done today. Yeah. And he just wants to come close to you again every single day. So there's mercy, and it covers all of it.
Amen. I don't think I have anything more exceptional than that to add. I just love, I love living in reality. That's kind of just like a core focus of my life, is like living in reality. I think so much of our world is aimed at suspending us from reality or trapping us in representations of reality and not reality itself. And I think it's just one of the tragedies of fantasy is that it takes us away from reality, which is where the presence of God is, where the truth is, where he is, where beauty is, right? But coming back to it again, like it can be a slow process. And also, none of us live perfectly in reality. Like, it's a daily effort to just live entirely in reality, to not allow myself to be totally abstracted, whether by temptation or distraction or busyness or whatever may come into my day to rob me of the ability to be in the Lord's presence. But he's always there. He's always there, just ready to help you reground. And that's, I think, one of the most beautiful parts is, again, it can just take a simple breath. It can take a simple prayer and you're back. Because he's always waiting and always reaching out his hand. So yeah. Well, thank you, Annie, for joining me on the long-awaited conversation on fantasy. If you liked this episode, like our podcast, subscribe to it. Maybe share it with a friend. You got to be tactful, though, because you don't just want to, shoot a random friend an episode on fantasy and say, I feel like you're fantasizing. You should probably listen to this episode. Anyway, we trust your tact. But if you are a woman who is in need of support and accountability as you're recovering from a sexual addiction, you can find the link below to join one of our groups. If you're a woman who has had her own healing journey is interested. Wow. If you're a woman who has had her own healing journey and is interested in helping other women do the same, you can also find the link to inquire about being a small group moderator below as well. If you'd like to bring a Magdala group to your college campus or to your parish, that link is in our show notes as well. Words are so hard, guys. If you are in need of accountability software, you can use the code Magdala to get 30 days free of Covenant Eyes. And if you want to break from your smartphone, you can use the code below to get a discount off of a light phone, which is a tech minimalist phone that will hopefully free you up a little bit. And finally, if you're interested in getting more exclusive content while supporting Magdala's community, you can become a patron at the link below, or if you're just interested in financially supporting us and also prayerfully supporting us, you can consider becoming a donor, and you'll find that link below as well. We're grateful for every woman, every man, everybody who's a part of our community, every which way. And hopefully we'll catch you soon.